He's not wrong. The tradition I grew up in, 45 minutes was the average, sometimes an hour. And I'm learning as a diaconal student the reason why sermons or reflections are short. And there's some very good points that I'm learning. One of them being is, when you're confident enough in your faith, you don't have to try and prove you're right. You can just relax and let it flow out of your life rather than how smart you think you are. So, it's an honor to be here today and to have Ian. He downplayed his role in my journey. He's actually my mentor. And I was very fortunate to hear that there was a diaconal minister in the Okanagan Valley, because they are fairly rare. And so with the CCS program, you're supposed to find a diaconal minister. And I could have done it over internet with someone, but I'm very fortunate. We've met in Kelowna twice, and we talk on Zoom quite a bit. So Ian has been an incredible source of life and support for me. You're lucky to have had him, and I'm sad that you guys have to see him go. I used to come to Peachland a lot as a kid. So I grew up in Kelowna. My first 13 years were in the west side. And Peachland is my mom's favorite place in the Okanagan to come to. She likes the rocky beach because it's clean. Kelowna side, sandy, dirty, seaweed, kind of gross. So we would always come to here. But as a kid, no one likes to play on rocks and walk in the water without flip-flops and your feet hurt. And it's like, but my mom was like, sorry, I want clean water. So we got into the floaty thing. We would just bring floaties and we'd float out in the water where we didn't have to walk on the rocks. And we would get ice cream. No matter what time of year, whenever we came to Peachland, we'd go down there and we'd get ice cream. And then when I was older, we moved from West Side over to the Mission. And we couldn't afford one of those fancy speedboats, so my dad bought a 16-foot fishing boat, and we would humbly tour the other side of the lake and find little beaches. And then, of course, we would come across in our fishing boat and get ice cream, sit at the park, and then head across again. A couple times we got stuck in a storm where whitecaps came in our little fishing boat, a little scary. But I have many memories here, and never even knew there was a United Church here all those years. And here I am today, returning for a very different reason. So I grew up with a particular worldview that was kind of proposed to me as scary. Very fear-driven understanding of our existence. And in the last 8 years or so, my faith has been on a very evolving journey of challenging that worldview and wondering if maybe it's more of a benevolent universe than a scary one. And so I have dove into philosophy, psychology, and brain science to aid me in understanding my theology. And CCS has been such a lifeline to re-anchor that kind of understanding. This new understanding that I have and I'm building upon. This passage this morning that you heard can, at the surface level, can be a little challenging, a little unnerving, kind of some ways of saying things that we may not feel comfortable with. And I would have had a very different view and understanding of what this meant 25 years ago. But I read it now, and it's like, it's still challenging, but it's hopeful. It's actually, in some ways, it feels like good news. Because it brings a whole new way of seeing and understanding. Let's start off in Genesis, where it all began. I grew up believing the story of Genesis was a literal historical event of how human beings were created. My stance now is that it's a beautiful and true mythical understanding of how things came to be as we understand them now. In Genesis 2:7, it talks about how God created Adam out of dust, and then, when he was done, breathed life into Adam's nostrils, and he became a living being. Without going too deep into it, breathed the Spirit into Adam, and Adam became the image of God, living. And then later, Eve was created, and it doesn't say emphatically that God did the same thing, but we can assume that the breath of life was breathed into her also, because she was alive. What's interesting with that is that that's the Spirit of God that brings life. So what's encouraging is, as long as we're all breathing, guess what? We have the Spirit. You can't have it or not have it. You just have it. If you're alive, you have it. And that's a really refreshing new understanding for me. And that breath is like a seed for the true self. That is the self that God loves and has created. And then in Genesis 3, we come to this part where it's a little unnerving in the sense where there's this tree you're not supposed to eat of. And if you do, some spiritual traditions see that tree as this tree that doomed humanity forever. And the way I understand that now is when they eat of that fruit, and we today, because really they're an archetype for us as well, when we eat of that fruit, that's the beginning of what it is to be human, and that's the ego. And so we have the Spirit of God living in us, and we have the human side, the physical existence of the ego. And so what if eating of that fruit was not the thing that doomed humanity, but actually was the thing that actually was the beginning of what would make us wise? The knowledge of good and evil isn't bad. Isn't that what wisdom is? To be able to know the difference between good and evil? So, maybe the snake was right. You become like God. God is wise. What if eating the fruit helped us become like God? But through pain and suffering, because actually managing that ego can be difficult. So we have to carry this tension. Each one of us have the Spirit and the ego. Neither bad. It just is. So now what? Well, we have to wrestle with ourselves. We have to become self-aware and understand what is going on inside of us. Understand in what moment what's driving us. You know? So, in Romans, the first verse, first I want to take some liberties with the passage and insert ego instead of sinful nature. And some translations say flesh. So if we were to change sinful nature into ego, then the verse would sound something like this. So letting your ego control your life leads to destruction and hopelessness. But letting the Spirit control your life leads to an inner peace of living in your true self. To me, that is so much more open and accepting to our human condition, that we are not bad, but we do have some things to figure out in order to become wise. One thing I learned last week, which I'd never thought of before, was the word sin is largely understood in our culture today as something that you do that's bad. You know, you've made God upset at you. But if you look at sin as a noun, it literally just means living in the egoic false self, or being driven by the egoic false self, which that self, if left to its own demise, will lead us into destructive thoughts and behaviors. So the real issue isn't the things that we might do that are bad, or the thoughts we might think that are bad. It's the thing that drives that behavior. and those thoughts. And so we don't have to feel that heaviness of, oh, I'm a sinner. It's like, no, I just have an ego, and I just need to make sure it doesn't take over and isn't in charge. And so, as we let the Spirit take control of our lives, and we willingly surrender the Spirit in our lives to be the one on the throne of our life, then things start to move smoother. I have a story in my life where there was a time in my life where I was wanting a bit of a career change. I've been a carpenter my whole life. And I met a guy who was doing concrete countertops. And I was like, what? Sidewalks, like driveways, yes. Countertops? So it intrigued me. So I went online and I'm looking like, this is actually really cool. I never would have guessed this was even concrete. It's so nice. How can it be concrete? So I actually started messing around the side of my house, pouring little pieces, seeing how beautiful I could make it. And I started to learn more and finally like, you know what? I think I want to do my kitchen counters. So I ripped out my old kitchen counters and started making these on the side of my house, and I built them and put them in, and there were some issues, but I was like, this is not too bad. So I thought, I think I'm going to start a business doing this. But as soon as it was no longer my project where I could give myself grace for any failure, and I started doing jobs for other clients, oh boy. Because I realized really quickly, you can do everything you can to make concrete perfect, and you'll never get perfect. It's just the nature of concrete. And I literally tried to make it perfect and literally made myself sick. It was killing me because I was trying to make it perfect because I was terrified of my clients being unhappy because I was charging $100 a square foot. That's expensive. And the fact that if I had a client say, wrong color, what's that weird spot? I don't like it. I'd have to redo it or give all their money back. And I would literally lay awake at night, terrified. So what was driving me to do a good job wasn't creativity, spontaneity, flexibility, joy. It was fear and shame and anxiety where it was crippling me. I was doing something that I liked or loved, but it was killing me. I'm like, wow. So anyhow, I had a designer that kept telling me, Drake, you're actually ruining concrete by trying to make it too perfect. The reason as a designer I'm actually wanting concrete is because I want it to have natural character. But you're removing the character. And she kept using this phrase that I heard but didn't let sink in. And she said, concrete is meant to be perfectly imperfect. And I was like, okay, I like that, but I couldn't live by it. So I continued stressing myself out. What I'm wanting to kind of leave you with in this idea is that our humanity, God has created this human existence for us to be here, to have to sit in the discomfort of being perfectly imperfect. We can't actually be perfect, but we can be on the journey towards perfection based on the viewpoint from a loving God. And it's beautiful. And so the fact that we have to kind of live with this tension can feel awful. But in actual fact, if it's a journey towards divine wisdom, then man, what a beautiful outcome. And we hope that the older we get, the more we surrender, the more we open up to this wonderful existence in the Spirit and our true selves, growing closer to connection with God. Another thing that I've realized is that the ego is here. It's part of us because it's here to help us physically survive, to make sure we're dressed, we're fed, that we are safe, all that stuff, and that's good. But this ego is not meant or created to connect to God. It's literally just to help us survive here as a human. But the true self in us that is Spirit-led is meant for connection and intimacy with God. And so, when we understand the concept of Jesus now as a rabbi, and the rabbinic tradition back then was, when a rabbi asked disciples to join them, it was the rabbi was tough on his disciples, very tough. Jesus says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Come, hang out with me. It'll be a joy. And I was talking with Ian on the phone about this, and I was like, actually, I just realized something. What if, yes, Jesus was a kind and gracious rabbi, but not only that, he was showing his disciples what the Spirit is like, and that the ego is an awful taskmaster, but the Spirit is gentle and kind and not a burden. It's like, oh man, there's a deeper level to that verse. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. So the ego will stress us out, just like me doing concrete. My ego was destroying me while I was actually really good at what I did, which is kind of interesting. In Romans 8:11, which is at the end now, the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. So that resurrection doesn't have to just wait for us when we die. It can be now. We can begin to experience what it's like to live in the Spirit, only to then, after death, to even get it more increased. So in closing, what's interesting is, Jesus says many times, unless a seed dies and falls to the ground, it cannot produce more life. It's kind of like, we get this sense the ego has to die. But in actual fact, it doesn't, and it can't. As long as we're in our human physical bodies, we need the ego. It just is a really bad master. And so, it's interesting as I loved, I forget what part of the service so far was about spring. And I loved that because in autumn, it appears that all the trees die, doesn't it? But they're not dead. They're actually still growing. They just look dead. In the same way, the ego doesn't fully die. Hopefully, it just looks like it's dying. That's the goal. And so, we will eventually all physically die. But our ultimate who we are is not our body, it's our soul. And our soul doesn't actually die, it just transitions into something even more glorious than this. And so what a hope we have in this Easter season, that we get to just wrestle with this tension and sit with suffering with a hope that can get us through. Now, Ian knows I've been going through some trials in my life, and it's been quite difficult. And in preparing this, I needed to prepare this because I have been in a place in the last few weeks where I've been in turmoil, and my ego wants to pull me into this survival mode way of being. And I know this information, but man, to actually live it out, it can be tough sometimes because the pressures of this world, the disapproval of others, the things that come at you, it feels crippling. And it's like, why am I giving in to this? I know better. Well, welcome to being human, right? But in me preparing this, it actually has helped me. Like this morning, I feel way better than I did yesterday. And I'm really grateful. And so I just want to remind you that let this Easter season be a reminder of the ongoing pattern of inner transformation, letting go of the ego and saying yes to the Spirit, and letting that phrase, be perfectly imperfect, sit with you and give you hope. There's no pressure to nail it, to arrive, to be perfect. It's actually an illusion created by the ego. But the goal is to just become more loving. And we can only do that when we lean towards the Spirit. So, thank you very much for listening. I was supposed to be between 12 and 15 minutes, and I lost track. How did I do? Thanks.